I'm trying so hard to be grateful, but the truth is the pressure is destroying me because ever since the US Open, everything has felt like I'm being measured every day. By headlines, by expectations, by my body breaking down again and again, and it's starting to take away the love I have for tennis. And that scares me more than losing any match.
Emma Raducanu speaks like this. It is not a headline stunt. It is a warning from a young champion whose fairy tale became a trap, amplified by ruthless tabloids and relentless physical setbacks that keep eroding her confidence and joy. Subscribe to the channel for more updates. And the reason this confession lands like a shockwave is because Raducanu's entire modern identity in tennis was built in a single miracle sprint that the sport rarely sees. A run so clean and so improbable that it rewired public expectation overnight. In 2021, she arrived at the US Open not as a seeded favorite with years of tour scars, but as a teenager who had barely tasted the full grind of the professional circuit, and yet she produced a sequence of matches that looked less like a normal breakthrough and more like a once-in-a-generation anomaly, winning from qualifying through the main draw without dropping a set. Within the sports community, that feat became both a celebration and a trap. Because tennis does not forgive fairy tales for being rare, it demands that they become routine. Reports indicate that the moment she lifted that trophy, the conversation around her shifted from development to destiny. And destiny is a word that sounds flattering until it becomes a weight that follows you into every practice session, every press room, every minor injury update, and every early round match you are expected to dominate. Raducanu did not simply win a major, she became a national story in Britain, and that detail matters because British sports culture, powered by a tabloid ecosystem, can be uniquely unforgiving. According to sources familiar with how British media cycles operate, a young athlete can be elevated to icon status in a week and questioned just as aggressively the moment results do not match the myth, creating an emotional whiplash that is difficult for any person, let alone a teenager, to process. Analysts suggest that for Raducanu, the shock was not only the fame itself, but the speed of it. Because the public did not slowly learn who she was across years of gradual progress, they met her at the top, on the biggest stage with the brightest spotlight, and they expected her to live there permanently. That is not how tennis careers normally work, because even the greatest champions experience dips, injuries, and months where their bodies and timing simply do not cooperate. Yet the myth of the US Open run created an illusion that Raducanu could be immune to the sport's natural volatility. Within that illusion, every ordinary setback became news, and every decision became a referendum. And the most punishing part is that none of it required her to do anything wrong. It was the mere fact of being the miracle champion that turned normal growing pains into public crises. From a competitive standpoint, the tour that greeted her after the US Open was not the same tour she had briefly conquered, because opponents now prepared for her, specifically, coaches studied her patterns, and matchups that once might have been learning experiences became tests of whether she still deserved the label placed on her by the world. At the same time, endorsements and public appearances expanded her obligations. And while professional athletes accept that commercial success is part of modern sport, there is a difference between balancing commitments as a seasoned veteran and navigating them as a teenager, still learning how to manage training loads, recovery, nutrition, and the psychological rhythm of travel. Reports indicate that one of the most consistent challenges Raducanu has faced since that breakthrough has been physical breakdowns, the kind that interrupt momentum and complicate confidence. Tennis injuries are not just pain. They are uncertainty, and uncertainty is a mental tax because each time a player builds form, a new issue can force rest, reshape schedules, and delay progress. Within the sports community, repeated injuries are often discussed as a stop-start problem, and analysts suggest that stop-start development can be particularly damaging for a young player who needs match repetition to build tactical confidence and comfort under pressure. The result is a cycle where the public expects constant improvement, while the athlete's body demands patience, and that mismatch can feel like betrayal, not by anyone personally, but by the reality of human limits. Raducanu's confession points directly at that collision. The collision between external expectation and internal fragility, and it explains why she frames the pressure as something that is destroying her. Because pressure is not simply the moment of serving at breakpoint. It is a broader environment that tells you that any pause is failure, any caution is weakness, and any honest admission is a sign you are cracking. Within British media culture, injuries have sometimes been framed as excuses rather than medical realities, and according to sources who track tabloid narratives, the language used around Raducanu has swung between celebration and suspicion, which can create an atmosphere where a player feels she must justify her body as much as her tennis. That is a brutal position for a young athlete, because the body is not a machine you can command without consequence, and the more you force it to meet a calendar rather than a recovery timeline, the more likely it is to respond with another setback. The coaching carousel that followed Raducanu's breakthrough became another layer of scrutiny. In tennis, coaching changes are common, and many champions refine their teams repeatedly. But when a young star makes changes early, it becomes framed as instability rather than exploration. Analysts suggest that the constant public debate about Raducanu's coaching situation has created a narrative where her decisions are judged not on their merits but on their symbolism, as if each change is proof of chaos rather than the normal search for the right support structure. Within the WTA, where young athletes frequently enter the tour with limited experience managing professional teams, the development process often involves trial, adjustment, and learning, but the speed of Raducanu's rise shrank the patience audiences were willing to grant. Reports indicate that every new partnership was treated like a fix, and every separation was treated like a failure, and that cycle can quietly erode a player's sense of control. Control matters, because the one psychological anchor elite athletes rely on is the belief that their choices can shape outcomes. And when the outside world turns your choices into public theater, it becomes harder to feel agency over your own career. The tabloids, the talk shows, the online commentary, and the constant ranking updates create an environment where the athlete becomes a character in a story written by others. And Raducanu's confession sounds like a moment where she is pushing back, not with anger, but with exhausted honesty, saying that the story is costing her something real. To fully grasp the scale of what she is describing, consider what it means to win a Grand Slam as a teenager, and then immediately be expected to replicate it in a sport that is designed to punish repetition. The US Open run was not just a title, it was a statistical outlier, a perfect storm of form, conditions, and fearless momentum. And analysts suggest that the public rarely understands how fragile those storms are. The moment you become a target, opponents play you differently, crowds react differently, and your own internal expectations shift because you now know what peak feels like, and you are haunted by the question of whether you can return there. Within the sports community, some experts describe this as the afterglow trap, where the emotional high of a breakthrough is followed by a long period of comparison that makes normal progress feel insufficient. If you win the first round match in straight sets, it is treated as expected. If you lose a tight match against a top opponent, it is treated as evidence of decline. This is the logic trap Raducanu is describing when she says the expectations are impossible. Because the public standard is not based on realistic development, it is based on the single brightest moment. Add to that the specific intensity of British scrutiny, where national pride can quickly morph into national impatience, and you get a psychological pressure cooker that few athletes can navigate without scars. Reports indicate that Raducanu has often been asked to comment on her commercial profile, her popularity, and her star status. Questions that blur the line between athlete and celebrity. Raducanu's statement that her love for tennis is being affected is especially significant because love is the fuel that sustains athletes through injury and repetition. When love becomes associated with dread, the entire career becomes harder to carry. Analysts suggest that in Raducanu's case, the constant cycle of comeback attempts and renewed setbacks can create a learned fear of the next breakdown. A fear that makes the body feel like an unpredictable opponent. That fear can also distort training because pushing too hard risks injury, while training cautiously can reduce match sharpness, and either outcome invites public criticism. Within the sports community, this is sometimes described as the no-win corridor, where the athlete's most responsible choices are still framed negatively by outsiders. The relentless British press coverage can intensify that corridor. because it creates daily story pressure even when the athlete is simply trying to rehabilitate or quietly rebuild. The tabloids do not need a match to create a narrative. They can build a story around a training photo, a coach sighting, or a quote taken out of context. For a young player already fighting to regain physical stability, that constant narrative churn can feel like an invasion of recovery space, the very space athletes need to breathe and reset. There is also the question of protection, and why the WTA and broader tennis system struggle with it. Unlike some team sports leagues that can implement load management policies within a centralized structure, tennis is decentralized, with players making individual scheduling choices across a crowded calendar that rewards constant participation with ranking points. Reports indicate that while wellness initiatives exist, the incentives still push athletes to play because ranking drops can affect entries, seedings, and opportunities. Analysts suggest that young stars are especially vulnerable because they may feel pressured to accept appearances, play more events, and meet commercial obligations while their bodies are still adapting to the physical demands of the tour. Raducanu's case highlights how success can accelerate exposure faster than the body can adapt. The fairy tale created a global spotlight, but the body still had to do the slow work of becoming a week-to-week professional. Injuries disrupted that adaptation, and media scrutiny turned those disruptions into identity questions. Within the sports community, there is a growing acknowledgement that the system needs better guardrails for young athletes, not just in terms of mental health resources, but in terms of narrative protection, helping athletes control how much they are asked to carry publicly. Raducanu's confession is heartbreaking, precisely because it does not sound like a player seeking sympathy. It sounds like a player trying to survive the gap between what the world wants and what her mind and body can sustain. The larger question is how tennis, as an industry, responds when a young champion admits that the pressure is destroying her. Will the conversation lead to more compassionate coverage, more realistic expectations, and more structural support? Or will the cycle repeat, with the confession becoming just another headline to consume and move on from? That question matters because Raducanu is not the first young athlete to experience this collision, and she will not be the last. And the sport's future depends on whether it can celebrate miracles without demanding that miracles become permanent.